Since the beginning of this pandemic, we've deemed those who make the sacrifice of being on the front lines of our hospitals, our grocery stores, and our warehouses essential. But if they are to survive this pandemic, more is going to be needed to be done to protect them. My next guests say that if these workers are actually essential, then their lives are essential too. And our government has the capacity to invest in the things that we consider essential. Joining me now is Congressman Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts and the Reverend Dr. William Barber, president of Repairers of the Breach and co-chairman of the Poor People's Campaign. Gentlemen, thank you to both of you. Reverend Dr. Barber, you have made many points during this whole crisis that you and I have talked about. But the main one is that before we had a crisis on our hands, we had a crisis on our hands of poor people. We had a crisis on our hands of 40 million people who are food insecure, somewhere up to 54 million people who live in food deserts, over 100 million people who live in what some people would describe as poverty in this country, and they have been hit harder by this crisis than most Americans.
We had 140 million people, right, who are poor and low wealth, 62 million people work without a living wages. And now we call not only nurses and doctors, but those who deliver our packages, drive our buses, clean our offices, our hospitals, our janitors. They are all now called essential workers. 2 months ago, we called them service workers. And right off the bat, corporations got nearly $2 trillion. 4 bills later, the essential workers have none of the basic essentials: guaranteed living wages, guaranteed sick leave, child care, rent forgiveness, food protection, protection of undocumented workers. And so what we have now is we have people who are giving first-class service, but are getting second-class resources. And, you know, really, and I say this as a preacher, it's a damnable shame. It's a sociological subversion of equal protection, and it's a medical failure because it threatens us all. And this fifth bill must address it. Or we have to say, like Fannie Lou Hamer said, we must question America if we don't fix this issue and fix it now.
Let's talk about the health part for a second, Congressman. The Reverend has said tying coverage to employment has always been foolish, but in a pandemic that requires us to shut down our economy in response, it is madness, which is true because it's not just that we are giving them second-class treatment, people who do not have health care or who can afford to stay at home, but in fact it is a public health issue. At this point, there are more and more Americans who are prepared to look at something that looks a little bit more like universal health care, and you have proposed something called the Medicare Crisis Program Act to expand Medicare and Medicaid eligibility during the crisis.
Yeah, so first off, thanks for having me and thanks for shining a light on what is a critically important moment in our country. And there hasn't been a more eloquent and more dedicated moral force for justice in this country than Reverend Barber on these issues. And so always an honor for me to join with him in trying to push our country to live up to our values. And what is, I think, so critically important to know in this moment is that if there's a lesson to take from COVID-19, it's that your health and my health are linked. You are not going to stop a pandemic if you treat other people and say, hey, it is okay for this pandemic to spread unabated in your community because it's going to spread to me. So it's not just the right thing to do. It's not just the moral thing to do. It is the smart thing to do. And it is, in fact, the selfish thing to do. So for God's sake, at this moment, let's do what we need to do to make sure that everybody gets access, not just to coverage, but to treatment. Let's make sure that we treat people with the humanity and dignity that they deserve, particularly those that are allowing and enabling society to scrape through in some semblance of functionality. And that's what this bill does, but that's what the overall call for Medicare for All is about. It's about recognizing that common humanity and recognizing our right to health care.
The two of you have written an op-ed in the Washington Post. Dr. Barber, I'm going to read a little bit of it. It says, we need hazard pay for these essential workers. We need a living wage for all. We need guaranteed sick days, paid family leave, universal child care, and public transit worthy of the most powerful country in the developed world. We need a nationwide moratorium on evictions and foreclosures immediately. And looking forward, we need to reconfigure the policies that have kept so much housing unaffordable. It's strange, Reverend Barber, because those are not weird and outlandish things. And they certainly are not weird and outlandish things in almost every other developed country in the world, most of which are not nearly as wealthy as the United States. And yet everything you suggest there seems like it may be out of reach right now. Now, you've got a rally, I believe, the Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington on June 20th. Is that going to be an in-person rally? Because I think what you're trying to do is put pressure on people to say this is an urgent matter now. Do you think that's going to happen in real life, or is that going to be virtual?
Well, it's going to be virtual, but let me tell you the first thing we're doing. We're telling people right now to stay in place, stay alive, and organize, and don't believe the lies. And we're building a campaign for people to organize while they're staying at home. We're planning to put 100,000 calls into Congress, both sides of the aisle, to the Speaker and to the Senate leader. But on June 20th, 2020, we're talking about bringing together poor and low-income people, essential workers from all over the country, story after story after story, pushing their stories and also the agendas that must change. We're going to also have people like Jane Fonda and the former Vice President Gore and young people from Sunrise and the Hip Hop Coalition and on and on. I can go 45 state coordinating committees from around this country. We have to put pressure. Here's the issue. We have too many people in power right now, political power, who are too comfortable with other people's death. And we cannot stand for this. This is not some far left or extremism. What it represents is fundamental establishment of justice, fundamental protection of all of our lives. And if we cannot do this now, and now when people are dying, then it is shameful, it is deadly, it is lethal if we don't deal with these issues now. And that's why poor and low-income people and essential workers are saying on June 20th, virtually, we're inviting everybody to come, we will not be silent anymore. We cannot be silent anymore. This is not about left and right. It's not about Democrat versus Republican. It is literally about life and death.
What can you do, Congressman Kennedy, to get to bring some of these ideas to fruition? Is there an openness? There's certainly an openness amongst Americans in general to address some of these inequity issues in a House that's been broken for a while. But can you do it in the House in which you work?
I think we absolutely, not only can we need to, but keep this in mind, if you will. Through the 60s and 70s, the Vietnam War sparked a moral reckoning with our country and with our government. We have lost more people in the past 2 months than the nation lost during the Vietnam War. In 2 months. And they have been disproportionately lower income, disproportionately people of color. The impacts of this have been the same lessons of that Vietnam War that sparked an entire protest movement for a generation. That's the type of movement that we need. That's the type of movement I think Reverend Barber is trying to give voice to. And with that momentum, we can do these things. Because if there was ever a lesson from this crisis, it is that our futures are linked. And we cannot go back to normal when that normal allowed for this to happen. We have the ability now, and I think the understanding now, to make these investments and understand that the piece that Reverend Barber and I just articulated, all of those values are already true for a segment of our population. Right? For folks that have means, they're not worried about a mortgage payment. They're not worried about working from home. They're not worried about childcare. But for the folks that enable us to function, they are. And so it is just a fundamental question of fairness after we've gone through a crisis that has exposed the ways, the fractures and fissures and the gross inequities through our society. This should not be too much to ask. And I think with Dr. Barber's voice and the Reverend's voice and the power of the movement that he is leading, I have no doubt we can make some progress here.
And you know,
Alex, yeah, go ahead, Reverend.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things we're doing on June the 20th, and this is going to be, we're going to have coal miners from Kentucky joining with people from the Mississippi Delta. They're going to be white, they're black. We're going to have people from the Apache Nation. We'll have people from Carolina to California. I mean, we're talking about bringing together people like Jess Barks, who's in Alabama, who's a low-wage worker fighting to survive without health care, and Linda Nicholson from Ohio, and Juan Torres, and Holly Herbert, who's a nursing aide, Holly Henry, a nurse's aide who's being forced to work without protective gear every day. And she's saying she's been put in a situation of facing mass murder. These voices and faces must be heard, and we need the politicians to move now. And I'm saying the House ought to pass the right bill And if McConnell wants to keep calling the left wing something, then let him say it to the American public and say it in these people's faces. But put the bill on the table that will take care of